Support for this program is provided by the Foundation for Excellence in Louisiana Public Broadcasting and from viewers like you.
Hello and welcome to Louisiana Public Square. I'm Beth, Courtney, president of LPB. Tonight we'd like to welcome Bob Mann as our moderator. Bob is a Times-Picayune columnist and a professor at LSU's Manship School of Mass Communication. Welcome, Bob.
Thanks, Beth. Good to be here. It's certainly an important discussion we're going to have tonight. Looking forward to it.
It is indeed.
The June massacre of 9 African Americans in a church in Charleston, South Carolina, has led to a national discussion about Confederate symbols and the values they represent. Many communities are reevaluating Confederate memorials in their public spaces, and major retailers have decided to stop selling the Confederate battle flag. In Louisiana, there's talk of moving or altering monuments of Southern generals like Robert E. Lee in New Orleans Lee Circle.
Well, so do Confederate monuments belong in front of public buildings, or do they belong only in museums? Many argue taking down the monuments would lead the public to forget important lessons of the past. Others say the statues represent only the history of those in charge. Over the next hour, we'll hear from Civil War historians, African American community leaders, and legal analysts as we explore these issues and more on Symbol or Statement, History in Public Spaces.
My ancestors, and I had over 30 ancestors that fought for the South, that when the call came to pick up arms against an invading army, they did so.
Paul Gramling is a member of the Shreveport chapter of the Sons of Confederate Veterans. He says his ancestors fought for a noble cause.
To protect their homes, their families, their land. So that's what they were fighting for, was to protect what they had.
He's standing in front of a massive monument to those who fought for the South. It sits in front of the Caddo Parish Courthouse. Some think it's time for the monument to be moved.
They are calling for the eradication of a heritage of over 70 million descendants of Confederate veterans.
Gaines Foster is a history professor at LSU. He studies how Americans remember the Civil War. He says history isn't that concrete.
One of the problems with public memorialization is history is always inherently contradictory and ambiguous, and we need to understand that. And simply to celebrate is not to comprehend.
Lloyd Thompson leads the NAACP chapter in Shreveport. He wants the courthouse monument moved to a museum.
I'm not saying blow it up. I'm not saying run it out of town. Move it to where you can have your museum. We have a Confederate graveyard. Put it out at the Confederate graveyard where your soldiers are buried. But we shouldn't allow that kind of thing to sit in front of the halls of justice.
Thompson thinks that it's improper to memorialize the Confederacy outside the courthouse, where more people have been sentenced to death per capita than any other parish or county in the U.S.
Why come so many folks that look like me end up on death row? The monument may not solve the race issues, but at least we can start a conversation by saying we're chipping away at it one piece at a time. We're getting away with our monument. Now we're sitting down and talk about what's wrong with our justice system.
Logistically and legally, there may not be the opportunity to move the 37-ton piece of granite. To understand the conversations like this one that are happening across the state, you have to understand the past. That's according to Ashley Rogers, the director of operations at the Whitney Plantation. It's the only plantation museum devoted entirely to the story of the people once enslaved there.
Unless you understand the breadth and depth of African chattel slavery, how important, how intrinsic it was to this country, then you'll never understand why we need to have these conversations about, well, why are we still talking about these few Confederate monuments?
Visitors sometimes go through what Rogers calls a learning crisis when they tour the plantation. They're uncomfortable confronting the violence of the past and realizing how it impacts the present. She tells her tour guides to walk questioning visitors through original documents.
Go back and look at documents and ask Confederates, were they fighting over slavery? Because they'll tell you that they were. Go back to the 1910s when the Daughters of the Confederacy were erecting monuments all over the South and ask them, Are you doing this for white supremacy? And they'll tell you in their words that they were.
It's important to keep Southern pride from blocking out the past, Rogers says.
There's nothing wrong with being proud of where you're from, but it doesn't mean that you get carte blanche not to confront what happened in the past.
She says we need a new approach to memorials that balance different perspectives.
It is important to memorialize those things in appropriate spaces where there can be a conversation, where it's not just, here is this monument by itself with no context whatsoever. If you can't, understand the Civil War and the Confederate battle flag next to images of people enslaved, that's a problem.
Shreveport historian Gary Joyner is a member of the Sons of Confederate Veterans and the Sons of Union Veterans. He says the Caddo Parish Monument has nothing to do with slavery.
This is not a monument that glorifies the Confederacy. I know some people are going to go, why can you say that? I mean, that doesn't make any sense at all. It honors the memory and the lives of the people who fought to defend their homes, their heritage, but it does something else.
Joyner says it brings the past out into the open.
It's a bridge between the Civil War and Reconstruction in modern America.
And he says if the lessons of history aren't in the open, we are doomed to repeat it.
History doesn't have an axe to grind, but people do.
Still, Foster says, monuments may not hold as much power as some think. They don't shape behavior.
To me, the most important thing is to confront and to comprehend and to acknowledge the past, which I think we can do in a lot of very different ways, besides renaming every building or tearing down every monument.
And Foster says monuments could be a distraction from the conversation we should be having, how to make our society more equal in the future.
Our views of the past are inevitably shaped by our notion of what we want our current society to look like. Until all Americans are fully committed to a society of racial equality and equal opportunity, then it's going to be hard for us to address the issues of the past if we also don't address the issues of the future.
Joining us to explore history in public spaces is our studio audience. It includes members of the Sons of Confederate Veterans and an NAACP university professor and New Orleans residents. And we also have students from the Legislative Youth Advisory Council from Gina and Calvin. Thanks to everyone for being here this evening. LPB asked viewers and social media followers to participate in an online survey on tonight's topic. Nearly 400 individuals have responded. Here's a look at some of the findings. When asked which statement most closely aligns with their opinion of the Confederate battle flag, 46% of respondents say it is a symbol of racism, 31% say it is a symbol of Southern pride, 19% said their opinion didn't fit with either statement. An overwhelming majority of respondents, 95%, said laws should not hamper an individual's ability to fly the flag on private property. 3% said the flag should not be allowed on private property. But 66% said they were against state and local governments displaying the Confederate battle flag on public grounds. 30% supported its display. When it comes to memorials on public property, 61% said they think monuments to the Confederacy and its soldiers should be allowed in front of courthouses and other public areas. 32% do not. When asked about memorials to slaves or black soldiers who fought in the Civil War, support for them on public spaces rises to 81%. 10% of respondents opposed their display. And when asked if veterans of the Civil War should be memorialized like veterans of other wars America fought, 72% of respondents say yes, 18% say no. So let's start there. What do you think when you see a monument to the Confederacy? Do you think monuments should be changed to include other viewpoints? I'll open it up. Kevin.
It's I just want to point out a survey that I just found out about a few minutes ago from Triumph Strategies, I believe, that showed 68% support for keeping Lee Circle as it is in New Orleans. But you made a good point about opening up monuments to other viewpoints. I see no reason why we can't honor both Confederate soldiers and honor slaves, honor black soldiers who were freed slaves who took up arms for the Union and fought distinguishedly at places like Port Hudson and Vicksburg and other battlefields in the Civil War.
Is it a matter of balancing? Would some of you agree with Kevin that it's that the balancing with another monument to slaves would solve the problem? Anybody want to?
Not really. Not really.
Thomas?
No, because that would be saying that the war was about slavery, which it wasn't. It was about economics. And I'm perfectly fine with monuments to black soldiers and or slaves, but they should be with the side they fought for us. If they're going to have a black federal soldier, which there were a lot of them we know, they should be north of the Mason-Dixon. And if they're going to have a monument to a black Confederate soldier, which there were plenty of those too, you put him right there on the courthouse square. I'm fine.
Dr. Samuels, I think you have a...
But see, your comment actually underlines what the real issue is. The war was fundamentally about slavery, and we know that because the framers of the Confederacy said so. And all we have to do is do a mere Google search and read what they said they were fighting for. And so to the extent that we're having this debate, a lot of it's because we have told a lot of lies to ourselves about what this war was about. This war was fundamentally about slavery, and without the institution of slavery, there would have been no war.
Randy, let's get...
If you're going to bring out the words of certain men, what they said, what the Confederates said, then you should bring out what the Northerners said at the same time. Abraham Lincoln said the black race is clearly the inferior race. He said blacks should never get to vote. Blacks and whites should not intermarry, and things like that. So he also said that if he could free all of the slaves and save the Union, he would do it. If he had to free one slave to save the Union, he would do it. And if he freed none, he would do it to save the Union. So that kind of cuts into that all about slavery thing.
Well, let's get back to the idea of the monuments, though, and that is the debate that we're having in this country and in this state and in New Orleans in particular right now with Lee Circle. Joyce, what would you say to the mayor's proposal to remove the monument of Robert E. Lee from Lee Circle?
Not being a native of New Orleans, I'm a little reluctant to share an opinion about that particular
or just in general,
monument.
Just those monuments in general.
In general, I have to underscore what Dr. Samuel said. This nation has been reluctant to acknowledge so much of its history, just as the statements that have been made by Randy here. We know that in Texas, the very Declaration of Secession stated that the Africans absolutely had no part in the establishment of the Union. Nevertheless, their work, never mind their blood, never mind the fact they were brought here in slaves against their will, which is totally antithetical to the notion of freedom upon which this nation was founded. But after they were here, forced to serve for free, they were then told by whites who had come here and taken the land from Native Americans that it was only whites and their posterity for which America had any notion of government or this government. And so we cannot get away from the fact that the symbolism of these monuments and the symbolism of things like the Confederate flag represent something that is grounded in a notion of white supremacy and the inferiority of the African race. It flies in the face of everything we call American. It flies in the face of democracy and freedom and the right to pursue your liberty and happiness.
Betsy.
My comment is more about awareness. If you polled prior to this episode of situation in South Carolina. If you polled people what Lee Circle was about or what most of the other monuments about, I tell you 99% of the people would have no idea what that was about. It's almost irrelevant. I mean, the point of Lee Circle, people use it directionally to get around New Orleans, but I think very few people have a real awareness of what these monuments are about. And so are we wasting a lot of energy talking about things that are minor when we have real substantive issues to deal with in our society today?
I want to ask one of our students, Tony or Jacob, you've got to be sitting here maybe wondering, this is all stuff that happened 150 years ago. Why is our society still debating these symbols and what they mean? Do any of you have any thoughts about why that is, why it's still such a hot topic 150 years after the Civil War?
I think people have based their main opinion right now on the things that happened in Charleston, South Carolina. I don't think that this problem was as big, a month ago? I don't think this was a big problem. I personally think that the Confederate flag should not be flew on the government property such as the Capitol. But, however, I think it's okay to fly it in your private property. If you want to fly it in your front yard, fly it.
Mm-hmm. Jacob?
Well, to me, this is it's a slippery slope on what they're trying to do, because where do you draw the line if you get rid of the statue on Lee Circle? If you get rid of it on Lee Circle, do you go and remove the statue of Andrew Jackson on Jackson Square because of his involvements with the Indians and the Trail of Tears? It's just a slippery slope, and the guidelines have to be set to make sure that doesn't happen.
Andrew, you're a retired high school history teacher. What would you, if you were back in the classroom today and this topic was obviously being discussed, what would you tell your students about this, trying to put this in context for them?
Well, I think I would ask them a question and perhaps ask the same question to this group tonight, Bob, and that is, why are we all here tonight? And the fact is we're here because a young man named Dylan Roof did an unspeakable thing in Charleston a few weeks ago. And prior to that, he posted online very prominently himself waving the Confederate flag. And had he not done that, I don't think any of us would be here tonight and this program would not be on. So my question is really, or my point would be, the Confederate flag, the battle flag, was not a big deal 2 months ago, but suddenly it is. And I think what's happened, and we can look back as far as the 1950s and 60s and the Civil Rights Movement and the anti-civil rights, or the Southern segregationist movement, if you want. That's when the Confederate flag became a big symbol to both sides. In other words, the Confederate battle flag has been co-opted by radical segregationists, and that's made it a hot-button issue. And that's why we're here discussing it tonight. The statue of Robert E. Lee at Lee Circle in New Orleans is not a hot-button issue. People drive around it daily and don't think twice about it. But it's that flag which has become a symbol, which Dylan Roof made such a big deal of just a few weeks ago in his unspeakable crime, that has put us here. And it's a question we have to face.
That's an act that really did change the debate in this country. That's all just for a moment, we're going to hold it right there because that's all the time we have for this portion of our show. When we return, we'll be joined by a panel of experts to further explore symbol or statement history in public spaces. Welcome back to Louisiana Public Square. Tonight, we're discussing how we display history in public spaces. Joining us now is our panel of experts. Alfreda Tillman Bester serves as General Counsel to Louisiana's State Chapter of the NAACP. She is the principal attorney with Tillman, Bester and Associates and the host of Perspective, a weekly community interest radio talk show. Dr. Sam Hyde is a professor from Southeastern Louisiana University who specializes in the history of the Florida parishes. Dr. Hyde is also the director of the Center for Southeast Louisiana Studies at SLU. Ray Diamond currently teaches at the LSU Law Center. Professor Diamond has written widely in the area of constitutional law, race relations, and legal history. His research on the Second Amendment has been cited in Supreme Court documents. Mark Upton is the chairman of the board of the Foundation for Historical Louisiana. The foundation promotes preservation of historic properties around the state. He's also a federal public defender. Before we go to our audience questions, I'd like to first ask each of you briefly, from your perspective, what message do Louisiana's Confederate monuments send to the public? Ms. Bester?
Let's start with me.
Yep.
Well, I'd just like to say that symbols matter. And the symbols of the Confederacy are symbols in my community of hate, of oppression, and of brutality. I think that we, as a society, because we are a diverse society, have to take note and be empathetic towards others other than our own culture. There is nothing redeeming in my community about symbols of the Confederacy. Nothing. I hear people talk about it being about history, about the pride of the South. Well, I'm a Southerner. I take no pride in those symbols. None. I think that it makes me think when we put those symbols in public spaces. I am a lawyer, so I certainly believe in the First Amendment. I think everybody who believes that that's a symbol of their heritage ought to be able to fly it all over their property. They can take it. I love seeing them on pickup trucks because I know who you are. I know who you are. And so I know that I'm not someone that person is likely to tolerate. But I do not want it on my state capitol. I do not want it on the courthouse that I enter into. African Americans and minorities are at least 40% of the population in Louisiana. We're not yet the majority. And so it makes me think about Lonnie Ganier's book, The Tyranny of the Majority. So I don't care what you think. I don't care how you feel about this. We're the majority. We're going to vote it in. So I just think that we need to be more empathetic towards others.
Okay. Dr. Hyde?
Yeah, well, Rob, there's no easy answer to that, of course, because the simple truth is that symbols mean different things to different people, and hopefully that's something we'll be discussing tonight. Also, I think there are gradations of symbols also, that if you're talking about the Lee Monument and you're talking about the Confederate battle flag, I think you're talking about two very different things in terms of how they're perceived by the public.
Mr. Diamond?
Well, I think history is a funny thing. You can tell the truth with history by presenting multiple perspectives. And you can be less than fully truthful with history by not presenting a multiplicity of perspectives. And I think with most of the Confederate monuments these days, we are greeted with only one perspective, and it is not a true perspective. We see Confederate monuments, at least in the majority population, as indicative of honor and bravery and simply being a symbol of Southern heritage, and I must add Southern white heritage. But what we don't see with those monuments is that they are also a symbol of racism, of racial subjugation, of slavery, and indeed of treason. I've made it a point. Justice Black used to keep his Constitution with him constantly. Article 3, Section 3 of the Constitution reads that treason against the United States shall consist only in levying war against them or in adhering to their enemies, giving them aid and comfort. What Robert E. Lee did was treason. What Judah P. Benjamin did was treason. P.G.T. Beauregard, treason. And I think that our monuments, if we do not recognize that, we are not representing what real history is, because we're only representing a limited and, in that sense, false perspective.
Okay, thank you. All right, Dr. Upton, or Professor Upton?
Actually, just regular Mark Upton. I agree with the other panelists, and I think this conversation that we're having tonight is important. And it's what, I'm speaking of my own personal opinions and not the opinions of the Foundation, but The reason that I'm a member of that organization is because history matters. There's a difference between acknowledgement and glorification. And I think if we acknowledge history and study history, and it engages us in conversations like the conversation we're having tonight, so that we come to a better understanding of where we come from. I think it's problematic for the government to have symbols that it lists as official symbols when they're like the Confederate battle flag, to fly that on the Capitol. But the First Amendment allows us to have that on our own property and to stick it on our pickup trucks, whatever we want to do. But we need to acknowledge and study history so that we don't repeat the mistakes of the past.
All right, let's. Thomas, you were shaking your head earlier. Why don't you? You want to?
I would submit that if you see a truck with a Confederate flag on it and you know who that person is, then you're a bigot because you don't know who I am. I don't have any problem with you. I don't like mean people. Just because I have a Confederate flag, I got a tie full of them right here. Does that make me a bigot?
Your flag says to me that you endorse and that you take pride in.
You're making assumptions about that person in that truck, and you don't have any clue except he's got a Confederate flag. You know he won't like you.
Do you make the same assumption when you see a white person?
Let's let her finish her answer.
No. I'm not going to make that statement. Oh, I have lots of friends who are white, but I do. What I'm saying to you is that is what your symbol says to me. It's because that is what the symbol has been used. It may have been co-opted. It may have at one point meant something else. But to me, I would tell you 95%, maybe 99% of people in the African American community, that flag says that you celebrate evil, which is the hatred, the bigotry, the oppression, and the brutality that was heaped up on our community and upon people that most of us who are of my age, which I won't say, know people who were victims of it. It is also something that people now use as a symbol of oppression. It was no accident that this young man over in South Carolina covered himself in that Confederate flag. He knew exactly what that flag meant, and he knew that the people that he thought were inferior to him, he knew what it meant to them.
You're talking about the flag, but we're also talking in this country about other symbols.
Yes.
The statues, Robert E. Lee and Lee Circle in New Orleans, and other Confederate memorials around the state and around the country. Anybody else want to talk about how those are perceived?
Well, I think these memorials represent a teaching opportunity, and they're a teaching opportunity that I suspect, we don't take advantage of. I can recall growing up in New Orleans and seeing Robert E. Lee's statue, seeing Beauregard's statue and Judah P. Benjamin, and I also remember my father teaching me who these people were and teaching me what they fought for, and it became meaningful to me that I lived in a city where these people were celebrated. I think we need to use this as a teaching opportunity. Now, on the subject of the flag, however, that is a completely different matter. I think the flag was folded. It was presented and it was folded by Robert E. Lee many, many years ago. The war was over. The use of the flag should have been over. That flag came back into prominence in the 50s and the 60s as a symbol of white Southern resistance to desegregation. It is a symbol of racism. And what I believe is that the flying of the flag represents uncivil behavior. It is the flying of a flag which makes a significant portion of the public very uncomfortable. So It's not illegal, and it shouldn't be illegal. But I think that conversations like the ones that we are having today will help us to understand how to communicate better with one another, and it may cause all of us to moderate, to change our behavior.
We're going to go to back to our panel and our audience. And Tim, you had a question about the monument to Robert E. Lee in Lee Circle.
Well, my opinion is that, history is just that. It is history. We can't change it. I mean, go to your point about it's a teaching opportunity. Shouldn't we just move on from that and then honor other members and heroes of the community? I mean, I'm from New Orleans, so I'm really only speaking of New Orleans. Shouldn't we, instead of tearing down, build up? I mean, what does that teach us is that we can't erase history. We can't hide it. It should be in front where we can learn about it. So why not continue that? I mean, I have Cherokee in my blood, yet I see no Cherokee monuments of any kind throughout the city. Why not go there?
Sam, you want to take that?
Well, I'll say something that I think, and I'm glad to see that everyone seems to be making the distinction between the battle flag, and let's be clear about the one we're talking about, and the monuments. And not to tangle with a law professor about legal issues, but he mentioned the issue of that was treason, and I don't think that that's entirely clear because, or a certainty by any means, because each of the secession attempts that occurred in this nation, be it the Virginia-Kentucky resolutions, the Hartford Convention, wherein New England said secession was legal, and they were all in favor of that until the Battle of New Orleans changed their perspective very much so, or the nullification crisis of the early 1830s. In every case, they were arguing the preeminence of states' rights over federal power. And the way most of us that study this very closely look at it is that that issue was resolved at Appomattox, period. So what Robert E. Lee and others like him thought in 1861 when they made the decision, very begrudgingly in many cases, to go with their state and side with the Confederacy, they didn't see that as treason at all. And so for us today to look back on it and say, well, that was treason, that's post-Appomattox. And that's one of the things that concerns me about a debate like this. We're often interjecting the perspectives of our current world onto the way people thought at that time. And I couldn't agree more that you can't, the war, central to the war was the issue of slavery. It's what drove the regions apart. And I'm not in agreement with those that say that was not a part of it. But it was far more complex than that. Okay, there were a lot of different issues, and I think that's what we're talking about when we make the distinction between the battle flag and these monuments.
Let's go back to our audience. Christopher, you had a question.
I don't have a question as much as I just sort of feel like we're still fighting the Civil War in this room. I feel so much racism. It hovers over us. The conversation, we're talking about a battle that was 150 years ago. We need to move forward. We need to transform. We need to find something that can unify people. We can bring them together. It's a flag, a symbol, a stand that is 150 years old. It's derisive. We need to find something to bring people together. And if we continue to sort of bicker about the legitimacy of this and that at different times, we're never going to get anywhere.
Mark, how do we do that?
Well, I think I disagree. I think these conversations are positive things. I think it's very important. You can't run from your history. It won't go away. But we can interpret it, and we can study it, and the reason that the Foundation for Historical Louisiana tries to preserve history is because not only is it part of who we are, but we want to preserve it going forward so that other generations can study it. As we move towards a better society, it's important to acknowledge where we came from.
And when you're talking about the idea of moving forward, we're also talking about moving these monuments elsewhere. In some cases, what?
To me, that I think that your history is your history, and if you're going to remove those monuments, those historic edifices from the public square, I don't think that's going to encourage the conversation. I don't think that's going to encourage the study of history. I think it's going to bury it. And it's not anything you can hide.
Are there regulations that prohibit, in some cases, the moving of some of these?
I believe there are. I'm certainly not an expert on preservation. We often consult at the foundation with preservation experts, but I believe that things that are protected by historic designation are protected from destruction or relocation.
I grew up with the mantra in my house, if you don't know your history, you're destined to repeat it. If you don't know your history, you're destined to repeat it. I don't think that talking about an issue makes us more racist. I think that talking about it, if I can hear you and you can hear me, then there's an opportunity for us to find common ground. I have mixed feelings about the monuments as they stand. I'm not one that thinks that we need to go and just knock down every monument, but I think that the truth of the monument, the whole truth about the monuments needs to be put forward, not just one perspective. And the one perspective of when the majority of our monuments were built in this state, in this nation, in this South, they came from one perspective, and it was from the Caucasian perspective, because the African American community, the Native American community, of which I'm part as well, didn't have a say. None of the minority community had a say in what those monuments were or what they said.
Taryn, you had a question?
Yes, and this actually goes into what Ms. Bester was saying just now, that the mere fact that we're in this room today speaking about the monuments that people in my community, the African American community, perceive as racist. That's kind of the only word that I can sort of think of at this point. That to me suggests that there is an issue with the monument. When we think about monuments that are erected in D.C. for the different wars that were fought, those monuments are erected in sort of a unification sense. But the monuments that are erected here in the South, they only represent one side and not necessarily all sides. So I guess not necessarily a question that I had, but more so a comment in saying that some monuments in my community and to certain people, minorities, suggest that this is a one-sided view and my community is not represented, whereas some monuments, all people are represented.
Kevin.
Yeah, this is also more of a comment than a question. Let me preface this by saying I don't agree with what the Confederate States of America stood for. It did stand for slavery, and the secession documents themselves in a lot of states said so. They were seceded because of slavery, but I also recognize that most Confederate soldiers were just simply fighting for their homes. We need to look at the whole perspective on history. Just as the Confederate battle flag was used in the 1950s and 60s to oppress the and the descendants, and even some of the African American members of this audience, the individual men may have just been fighting for their homes, which brings me to the monuments. The monuments are important because they are, as I didn't get the professor's name, about this can be a teaching moment to teach about the time period they were putting them up, about what these men stood for, and yeah, we should also honor the black federal soldiers that fought for Louisiana under the Stars and Stripes. So with history, we just have to be honest and look at the whole perspective.
I saw some head shaking over here. Thomas, you were
not necessarily, not just Lee and Beauregard, but in almost every courthouse square in Louisiana, there's a Confederate monument. All of these monuments, virtually all of them, were put up by the United Daughters of the Confederacy after the war, the descendants of the soldiers. Their men went off and fought, and when they died, the Federal soldiers threw their bodies in a ditch and covered it up. This is the cemetery markers for those men. These daughters and granddaughters had bake sales. Think of what it was like in the 1920s to raise $15,000 to put up one of these monuments. Their men didn't come back. They have no idea where they are. Like I say, they threw them in a ditch and they covered them up. You can see a national cemetery that's just jam-packed full of Federal markers. All of these monuments are the United Daughters of Confederacy's markers to their people that didn't come back. That's their tombstones.
Sam, you want to take?
Well, I say, and I know exactly what you mean by that, and a lot of us have been raised on the story. Like, just to give you one simple story, the famous story there at Missionary Ridge when the Confederate Army was driven from there on that cold morning and everything, Union general rides up, he sees a dead young Confederate soldier there, as he said, barely 14, 15 years old. He was thinking in his mind, thank God my son wasn't having to be out on this line like that, that he's safe at home and everything. The boy, barefoot in rags, had stayed at his position and died there. And the general said, roll him over, let me look at him. Unlike the Federal troops who were well supplied and had haversacks and everything, what the Confederate soldiers was typically carried in a blanket around their chest and everything. So they took his blanket off and opened it up. And inside the blanket was one darned sock, a half a palm full of brown sugar, and 6 hickory nuts. And that's all he had. And the general looked to his aide and said, my God, what type of people are we fighting? And by that he meant, if my own men were suffering that type of deprivation, the desertion rate would have been enormous. But I will say, Rob, that just like the way there has been a correction in the way we educate, back before the 1960s and everything, African Americans were invisible in history, except in negative ways and everything, and in caricatures and things like that. Just as there's been a correction with that, we may be reaching a point, and a compromise in this may be, that we do add some things that explain the way others would look at it, because black Southerners are as Southern as white Southerners, and the other side is correct that this depicts only one perspective. But to go around and say remove these monuments like that and everything is taking away exactly what this gentleman's pointing out. This is the spot not just to grieve, it's to remember, and as he said, many of their bodies are simply tossed to the side and there's no place else for them to go.
I have absolutely no problem with there being a memorial for the soldiers who died. None. My problem is that it is on public property. I think that it should be, especially not the courthouse, because of the things that I today experience in our courthouse as an officer of the court. But when I go into the court, I go into the court in this skin, and it matters. And if anybody told you today that it doesn't matter, then they're not living in the real world. I can tell you stories from yesterday of why it matters that I'm in this skin.
Randy?
I have major problem about the Confederate, the Southerners being the bad guys. The white Northerners are perceived as the good guys. They wore the blue, they came down and they loved the black people and they were fighting that war to free the black people. The northern whites felt towards blacks that they were inferior, much like the southern whites did, and it's a sad fact, but that's the way it was. So to want to put up statues here in Louisiana to the northern generals, Grant had slaves, Lincoln's wife was from a slave family, and I think they even, when she inherited slaves, they sold them. The great emancipator, he didn't free his wife's slave, they sold them for profit. So that's a misconception.
I don't think that anybody in the African American community thinks that every northern white person is the great emancipator. We're not that naive. Right. And we know, even Martin Luther King said that Southern blacks need to come to Chicago to learn how to hate. I'm sorry, I got that mixed up. He said Southern whites need to come to Chicago to learn how to really hate, because he had never experienced that kind of overt hate as he experienced trying to march through
he said that he was treated worse in Chicago than he was in Selma.
Trying to march through well, boy, that was good. Anyway, but trying to march through a neighborhood to mark an injustice. But there is a difference. There is a difference. Even now, we see whites in the southern United States and also Ohio and other states like that who are doing everything possible to disenfranchise us. See, I understand the symbolisms, but they mean far less to me than my reality. And my reality is still today that there is disparity in the way people of African descent are treated systemically in not just Louisiana, but throughout. And it doesn't matter your station in life. I'm a former labor secretary and undersecretary and all kinds of stuff, a lawyer with an MBA. But many times, the only thing that people see when they see me, especially when I'm not dressed like this.
Let's go to Albert. Do you have a question or comment?
You know, I think a comment was made, that the war wasn't just about slavery, it was a lot more complicated. And to me, that still betrays how much we have to go in wrestling with how intricately woven slavery is into the whole narrative of America. Slavery, in a lot of ways, helped finance the Industrial Revolution. Most of the slave trading companies were in the North, not the South. Slavery intruded on. Slavery is the reason for much of what happened at the Constitutional Convention. It affected the politics throughout. It gave the South disproportionate political power in this country, and there was a survey just recently. Gallup did a survey, but 57% of Americans, said that they didn't see the Confederate flag as a racist symbol, and that's just and we're not talking about the monuments here, but the question is, why do so many Americans believe that? Because there's been a concerted effort historically to deny that the Civil War was about slavery, and it's been taught in history. It was a specific project of Southern historians after Reconstruction to deny that the war was about slavery. And to the extent that that has been taught throughout our public schools for centuries, and Texas is ensuring that it will be taught for even more.
Mark, do we do enough in this country or in this state to teach about slavery? Are we? I mean, is there an imbalance here that we need to work on?
Interestingly, the foundation gave an award to John Cummings, who was the developer of the Whitney Plantation, which was mentioned earlier on this program. And John spoke that night about the education of America, both black and white America, on the reality of slavery in this country, and that it is he made a very powerful statement that was very moving to me, that it is an overlooked and undertaught segment of our history. I think I agree with him. And if you go to Whitney Plantation and you see what he has constructed there, it does bring forth the reality of what it was, of what slavery was like on the plantations across the South. And I think that is what these conversations are about. That is what other monuments that can be constructed will bring about, which is a much more realistic and truthful conversation about our history.
Ray, how would that, in your view, how would that be done? How would we do what Mark has said, a more balanced and real presentation of your history?
Well, I think we have to present, and I hate to use this expression, but both sides. It is said very often that winners write history. Well, unfortunately, losers write history sometimes too. The Japanese have a history in World War II which they do not own up to, because they deny, for example, the atrocities in China. They deny, for example, that they treated the comfort women as sex slaves. A winner, the Turks, they engage in history as well. They deny that they undertook a genocide against the Armenians. And I think similarly here, the South, a loser, has written a history. They are in control in some ways of the narrative, and it is the narrative of the gallant, courageous, honorable South, where tragedy took place. And that narrative, insofar as it goes, is correct. But it is also a narrative, again, of racism. of subjugation. And not to dispute you, Sam, as a political matter, of course it was true that the ability of states to secede as a political matter, that had not been established until Appomattox. On the other hand, as a legal matter, in 1819, McCulloch versus Maryland establishes the supremacy of the United States Constitution, establishes that it is not the states, it is the people that formed the Constitution, and put in place the understanding that the states are bound by that Constitution and cannot impede or burden in any way the carrying out of the Constitution. So I would suggest again, the narrative needs to include the fact, and it is a fact, that these proud, courageous people defending their homes and defending their rights, including their right to hold human beings as property, these people committed treason. That needs to be part of the narrative.
We're going to have time for about one more question. Jacob, you want to?
Yes, sir. What's your stance on statues that have been raised of former Confederate soldiers but have also served a purpose to the United States, as in Supreme Court Justice E.D. White? He served in the Confederate Army, and he was a main decider in the Plessy versus Ferguson case. So what is your stance on his statues of people like him?
Well, I think E.D. White is a perfect example. Sorry, I said E.D. White, and yes, Chief Justice White. E.D. White is a perfect example of what I believe is an extraordinarily generous act on the part of the United States government in lending legitimacy to the former Confederates, in bringing them back not only into the Union as states but as individuals, enfolding them. It is an act of graciousness, and it is an enormous statement that a former Confederate soldier, Chief Justice White, would serve on the same court as a former Union soldier, Oliver Wendell Holmes, that together they would help to make the laws of the United States. I think that generosity, if you will, is a part of the narrative that has allowed the Southern narrative to become, in some quarters, predominant. And again, I think we need to speak to a larger narrative than simply the narrative of honor and courage.
Sam, you want to take that as well?
Well, I'll just, and we'll agree to disagree about some points here, but one of the things, one of my teenage sons asked me one day, and he jokingly said, as a history professor, he says, "Dad, you bore people for a living, you know?" So, and he said, "Why would anyone want to listen to all this stuff you're saying? And, you know, this and that and that." And look, they had to live with me and, you know, drove around in order to get souvenirs on trips. They had to answer historical questions and everything and win points and everything. God bless them, you know. But I told him a simple truth, and that is, it wasn't, when we think about the Native Americans, and the gentleman here mentioned Cherokees and everything, and the utter destruction of their culture and what happened to them, it wasn't just an issue of technology difference and stuff like that. It was that the Native Americans did not have a written history. And I'm reminded of the scene from Dances with Wolves when the old chief, when the Kevin Costner character comes into the teepee there with him, and the old chief pulls out a Spanish helmet, and he says, "During my grandfather's grandfather's time, people wearing these helmets came into our area. We were able to drive them out. I don't know how we did it." And the point of that is, to us as historians, that if you don't remember your history, as we've said in here 10 times already, you may be destined to repeat it. But I think what we're seeing here is agreement, maybe, that we need to expand the way we look at history. That if there is a Confederate monument maybe on one side of the courthouse at Clinton, maybe there ought to be a monument right next to it or on the other side that talks about the other side of society.
Well, thank you very much. And we've run out of time for our question and answer segment. We'd like to thank our panelists, Ms. Bester, Dr. Hyde, Mr. Upton, and Professor Diamond for their insight on this month's topic. When we come back, we'll have a few closing comments.
Well, Bob, it certainly was a lively conversation, still a very hot topic, and I was actually thinking about public, popular culture these days. And growing up, it was sort of the Gone with the Wind culture, the glorification, but now we're seeing 12 Years a Slave. And I hesitate to suggest that next generations will be learning things from movies, but unfortunately I fear that may be where we are.
Well, and it started, that movie and others have started conversations here that I think are very helpful, and I think part of that was part of this conversation tonight.
I think it is indeed, and Ken Burns did a monumental task when he did the Civil War documentary series, right. And we'll be repeating it again in September, coming it up.
Oh, good.
So,
that's good.
So that's, I commend everyone to watch that. That's all the time we have, though, for this edition of Louisiana Public Square. We encourage you to visit our website at lpb.org/public square. While you're there, take this month's survey, view additional sound bites, and comment on tonight's show. We would love to hear from you.
10 years ago this August, Hurricane Katrina swept through southeast Louisiana, triggering what would become one of the nation's costliest disasters. This recovery process has involved a significant restructuring of New Orleans' education and healthcare systems and a dramatic shift in demographics. Join us next month as we examine those changes on Louisiana Post-Katrina, a decade of difference. Thanks for watching, and good night.
Good night, everyone.
For a copy of this program, call 1-800-973-7246 or go online to www.lpb.org.
Support for this program is provided by the Foundation for Excellence in Louisiana Public Broadcasting and from viewers like you.